Hello, and welcome to this year's Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor Lecture on Public Service. My name is Juliette Brody, and I am the Peter E. Haas Faculty Director of the Haas Center for Public Service at Stanford. I also teach at the law school and direct the law school's community law clinic. I want to acknowledge that there are more than 250 people joining from around the nation and the world already. It's only 4:30.5. I'm sure more will join, which is a testament to how important today's topic is and how appealing and important the two speakers are. So thank you everyone for being here. I want to start by recognizing that while we are scattered, we hundreds at various sites, this event is hosted by Stanford, which sits on the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people, and consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to at least acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relation to Native peoples. It is a privilege to be able to introduce you to two extraordinary leaders who will discuss this evening a timely question. Those of you who are old enough or cool enough to know who Bob Dylan is, and that may not be all of you, will recognize in their title, Democracy in America, Busy Being Born or Busy Dying, as being drawn from his work. It's a tough question, right? We have just marked the one-year anniversary of the siege on the US Capitol. At the same time, we have entered the third year of a pandemic that, rather than uniting us in the US against a common threat, has divided us. COVID-19 is but one example of how our information environment is so polarized that our nation cannot agree on the facts, let alone on a collective path forward. So, tough times. In light of this, I'm so grateful to Marshall Ganz and Sandra Bass, who are going to let us listen to and then join their conversation about this critical inflection point for American democracy. Marshall and Sandra have had remarkable careers in advancing social change and developing the next generation of civic leaders to carry that work forward. They will discuss whether indeed we are in the process of birthing a more inclusive, expansive notion of democracy, or bearing witness to the precipitous decline of what President Obama and many others have called the great American experiment in multicultural pluralism. Let me introduce each of them briefly. Marshall Ganz, whom we're honored to welcome as this year's Distinguished Visiting Scholar, is the Peter E. Hauser Senior Lecturer in Leadership, Organizing, and Civil Society at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He grew up in Bakersfield, California, where his father was a rabbi and his mother a teacher. And he enrolled in Harvard College, but left a year before graduating to volunteer with the 1964 Mississippi Summer Project, registering Black voters in the South. He had found his calling as an organizer for the Southern National Coordinating Committee, and he then joined Cesar Chavez in the movement to organize farm workers. He spent 16 years with the United Farm Workers. Then in the 1980s, he worked with numerous other grassroots movements to develop new organizing and voter mobilization strategies. In 1991, after a 28-year leave, Marshall did eventually return to Harvard, where he completed his undergraduate degree in history and government. He went on to earn a master's in public administration and a PhD in sociology. Now, in addition to teaching at Harvard, Marshall coaches and trains social, civic, and political groups around the world as part of the Leading Change Network, and we're so thrilled to have him with us tonight. Sandra Bass serves as Associate Dean of Students and Director of the Public Service Center at the University of California, Berkeley. She brings to that role over 25 years' experience facilitating social change, domestically and internationally, through public policy, community engagement, scholarship, and education. Sandra earned her PhD in political science from UC Berkeley and was then appointed as an assistant professor of criminology and political science at the University of Maryland, College Park, where she integrated service learning into her undergraduate and graduate courses. In 2002, Sandra entered the foundation world. She joined the David and Lucille Packard Foundation and went on to lead its girls' education, women's leadership, and reproductive health program in sub-Saharan Africa. She also served as executive director of Teach with Africa, an organization focused on cross-cultural learning for K-12 teachers in the US and South Africa. Sandra is a widely published academic author, as well as a sought-after nonviolence trainer and educator. I'm personally grateful to Sandra for sharing her wisdom and experience with us at Stanford as a member of the Haas Center's National Advisory Board. As you can tell, we have a lot to learn from these two about how to think about our current moment in public life. Busy being born or busy dying? Marshall will set the stage, and then he and Sandra will have a conversation. We want to make sure this is an interactive event, so we have reserved time for Q&A. Please feel free to enter questions in the chat, and we'll be calling on attendees to ask those questions following the conversation. It's now my personal and institutional pleasure to turn it over to our Mimi and Peter E. Haas distinguished visitor, Marshall Ganz. Marshall, take it away.
Thank you, Juliet. And thank you, Sandra, for being my partner in this, and to Tom and Luke and Tiffany, and Lauren, and the Haas Center for the kind invitation for this semester. Let me just say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you happen to be. And I just want to ask you if you would unmute and just respond so I could know you're out there in whatever your first language was, okay? So good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Good morning.
Good evening. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good evening.
Good night.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's that's the music of the future.
Erev Tov also.
And it's good music to hear. We can. The other thing I just want to say is we're not in the same room, but most of us can hear, see, and speak. So please turn on your screens. The whole point here is to be able to see one another, as well as the conversation that's going on. So please turn on your screens. Let us see you, so we can interact with one another and kind of see what's happening. In Hebrew, there's two ways to describe where you live. One is the word for sojourn, and the other is the word for reside. I've learned a lot in my sojourns, whether to Mississippi, where I found my calling as an organizer, or in Cambridge, where I learned how to pursue that calling as a teacher. But it's here in California, especially during my 16 years with the farm workers that I grew up, and here that I will always reside. So thank you for this opportunity to visit home. I don't have to explain where the Salinas Valley is. I don't have to explain where the Imperial Valley is, or even where Delano is. You can drop me pretty much anywhere, and I know where the roads go. And of course, there is so much left to do in this state, as in everywhere. So what about the question? Democracy in America, busy being born, busy dying. What do you think? You know, this is not a question to be answered by academics or lawyers or journalists or even politicians. It's really a question for all of us. And it's a question of all of us because all of us are a large part of the answer to the question. Are we enabling a process of birth, growth, and development? Challenging, to be sure, but with a sense of possibility? Or are we enabling a process of death, decline, and disappointment, leading to a kind of despair? You know, it doesn't require any work when we're enabling that, but it does wind up with a sense of despair. I'd argue that there's no neutral ground on this question. It's one or the other. This is so because democracy is not something you have, but something you do. It is a verb, and we are creating it or uncreating it all the time. I mean, take a look at the moment that we're in, the curse of COVID, the climate crisis, institutionalized racism, radical economic inequality, and 40 years of assault on government, not because it is government, but because it could be democratic. Well, chickens do come home to roost, and As my friend Tom Hayden used to say, change is slow, except when it's fast. And this is a fast moment, in case you haven't noticed. And it's in fast moments when things are in such flux, when things are in such turmoil, that our choices really matter. That our choices really matter. And moments when leadership and organizing and action really count. So what I hope to do in the next few minutes is to first say a few words about leadership so that we're clear what I'm talking about, what we're talking about. Second, the nature of the challenge. And third, some of the practices, not just ideas, but practices that can help us find a way forward. So let's start with leadership. My approach to leadership is, I'm still seeing some, black rectangle screens here. Let's get some more faces. It's much more interesting. My approach to leadership is rooted in three questions posed by the first century Jerusalem scholar, Rabbi Hillel, who, when asked, how do I consider what to do with my life, responded with three questions to ask yourself. And the first question was, ask yourself, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Now, that's not meant to be a selfish question. It's a self-regarding question. In other words, if you presume to offer engagement, leadership with others, you better be clear about what you bring to it, what you expect from it, and with enough self-awareness that you can actually see others. The second question is, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Because to be a who and not a what is to recognize that we exist in relationship with others in the world, and our capacity to realize our objectives is inextricably wrapped up with the capacity of others to realize theirs. And finally, he tells us to ask, if not now, when? It's not advice to jump into moving traffic. It's rather a caution against what Jane Addams described as the snare of preparation. Just another year of strategic planning, we'll have the perfect plan, we'll implement, the world will totally conform to our expectations. Maybe that's happened to you, it's never happened to me. Or, in some of our institutions, just another degree, and then I'll have all the information to go out and give the world its answers. That doesn't tend to happen either. The reality is that rarely can we learn to do well what we want to do until we actually begin to do it. In other words, that understanding flows from action rather than preceding it. And so this for me is what leadership is about, the interaction of the self and the other and action and how they work together. Now, it's important that these are questions and not answers because, well, I don't know, maybe you've had the experience of everything going well in your organization and people just can't wait to say, where's the leadership so we can thank them? I don't know. When do people say, who's in charge here? When do people say, is it when everything's great? Usually it's dilemmas, conflicts, contradictions, the unexpected, isn't it? And see, what it points to is that leadership is about a creative and adaptive kind of piece of work. When everything's working, the routines are working, what do you need leadership for? It's when the challenges come, that's when this adaptive capacity for leadership is required. And that's pretty challenging to sort of accept. Oh, I guess that's what I'm bought into here. It's a challenge. Do I have the skills that I need to deal with these new challenges? And that's a challenge to the hands. Can I use my resources in new ways? That's a strategic challenge to the head. And then there's, where do I get the hope? Where do I get the courage? How do I inspire the hope and courage in others that it takes to often take the risks involved in actually dealing with real challenges? And that's a challenge to the heart. So it's a way of thinking of leadership in a head, hands, heart kind of way. And so the definition that I've come to use for leadership is that it's about accepting responsibility, there's a choice, for enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty. So it's not about having all the answers. It's often much more about having the questions. It's also a kind of understanding of leadership that is not about position, but rather practice. I mean, I think we've all had the experience of people who occupy positions of formal leadership who turn out to be pretty awful leaders. I don't know if we can think of any recent examples. On the other hand, we meet people in neighborhoods, in workplaces, at kitchen tables who are exercising leadership in the way I'm describing it all the time. So it's thinking of leadership more as a practice, a way of doing things than a way of than a position. So now organizing is a particular form of leadership. It's a form of leadership that begins by asking not what's my issue, but who are my people? With whom am I entering into a relationship, a leadership relationship? This is thinking of leadership as relational, not as performative. It's not like I'm performing and putting on an act. I'm actually engaging with people in order to achieve a common purpose. Who are my people? Who are the people? Second, what are the changes that they need, that they want? Not what I think they want, but that they need, that they want. And second, how can we work to turn the resources that we have into the power that we need in order to achieve the change that we want? So this is not about like marketing products to customers. It's not about providing services to clients. It's about bringing people together to form a constituency. And that word comes from the Latin constare, which means to stand together. So it's about bringing people together to stand together, learn together, work together, decide together, act together, and hopefully to win together. So the other thing about organizing is that it's about power. Now, that's a scary word. I know, say power, and everybody, that's an issue. I mean, in Spanish, poder just means to be able to. It's having the capacity to. And, it's pretty intuitive what it's about. If you need what I've got more than I need what you've got, who's got the power? If you need what I've got more than I need what you've got, who's got the power? Point to yourself or point to me. Come on. Okay, I see I'm getting the, okay, what if it's reversed? What if it's reversed? Then who's got the power? Okay, I see, point yourself. See, power is not a thing that you have, it's a relationship. It's a relationship of influence between resources and needs. And when we have common interests, then by combining and working with each other to pool our resources and on behalf of our needs, we can create a lot more power with each other, like in a co-op. On the other hand, when resources we need are held by others whose interests are in conflict with our own, then we often have to figure out how we can mobilize our resources so as to give them an interest in cooperating with what we need to meet our needs. So that's kind of what it is. Now, if anybody concerned about this word power, Paul Tillich, the Protestant theologian, wrote a very cool book called Love, Power, and Justice, in which he argues that power without love can never be just, but love without power can never achieve justice. And it's in that sense that we're talking about power. Finally, organizing isn't just about winning a campaign. It's about winning whatever it is, but it's about building the capacity, the collective capacity, so that we come out of it stronger rather than weaker. And it's about developing leadership so we have the capacity to grow. Now, what about the challenge? Well, political scientist Sidney Verba once commented that liberal democracy is an experiment in whether equality of voice based on citizenship expressed politically can balance inequality of resources based on ownership and expressed economically. It's a literal question of whether governance is legitimate, to whom it is accountable, and who governs. Now, let's take that first equality of voice question. Not one person, one vote, but one vote, one voice. The truth is that we have never had a representative democracy in the sense of equal voice. And the reality is it's becoming less representative every day. In the US, it's been particularly challenging to achieve an equal voice in our public affairs, not only because of the historically deep structural inequalities of race, of class, of gender, and how these equalities, especially slavery, racism, rooted in an economic and political system that cultivated and depended on it, built into our electoral system 250 years ago to preserve the power of local elites, slave states and free, small states and large. Single member, first by the post districts, mean that 51% of the vote get 100% of the representation. 49% of the vote get nothing. Our friend and colleague Lonnie Guinier, who we lost last week, was one of the pioneers in seeing the problems in how skewed this form of representation was and why everything becomes a political binary. Gerrymandering by incumbents to protect their own seats or maintain partisan advantage make elections both far less competitive and less representative. This pattern was established with the 3/5 rule because in order to ratify the Constitution, Southern states demanded that enslaved people count for representation for which only white voters could vote. This built in a systematic inequality of representation of the enslaved, over-representation of the enslaved South, which in turn was reflected in the Electoral College as well. The Electoral College gives voters in New York, California, and Illinois no incentive to vote. Really reduces turnout and allows losers to become presidents. And then there's the Senate, the wonderful Senate. Boy, it's the center of the action right now. California has 39,538,223 people in it, and Wyoming has 578,759. Each has 2 votes in the Senate. So what that means is that 1 vote in Wyoming counts 68 times the vote of 1 person in California. The least populous states of Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, North Dakota, each state has at least 50 times more representation in the Senate than in California. And by the way, every Californian counts as 3/4 of a Texan. So it may be 1 person, 1 vote, but it is surely not 1 vote, 1 voice. And that is a critical dimension of what we're struggling with. The second point I want to make is about disaggregation of voice. You know, the balancing act between VRBA's inequality and equality got harder in 1976 when the Supreme Court decided in Buckley v. Vallejo that money is speech. This ruling doomed efforts to limit campaign spending, isolating the United States among other liberal democracies that limit campaign spending, equalize access to the media, and rely more heavily on volunteer mobilization. This promise of limitless spending stimulated the emergence of political business funded to the tune of $15 billion in the last election by turning politics into marketing, campaigns into advertising, candidates into brands, voters into data points, and debate into messaging. This transformation of the electoral means of production, we might say, was driven by television, direct mail, computer targeting, digital media, all sources of commissions for the professional consultants who themselves make the buys. Nobody makes money from mobilizing volunteers. To the extent that the political is about engaging people with one another in finding collective solutions to change, conflict, and opportunities in nonviolent ways, it's not a marketplace in which each individual pursues their own individual interest and through some form of magic turns out to end up in the common good. It's not true in the economy, and it's certainly not true in the political. Way back in the 1830s, it was de Tocqueville who recognized that in a democracy, the political is not simply the aggregation of individual voices, like polls or plebiscites, but the actual work of figuring stuff out. This requires association, which enables learning, which allows us to understand our individual interest in the context of a common interest, that allows the development of affective bonds that can support solidarity, and the actual practice of self-governance, which he called habits of the heart. Third challenge, citizenship. As your Josh Ober here at Stanford argues, it was in the 5th century Athens that Cleisthenes and team realized that membership in a polity that aspired to equality, at least for those included, could never depend on kinship and the hierarchical structures of kinship in the tribes then of Athens. So they reorganized the kinship tribes as civic tribes, based on geography, not based on kinship. And what they did, so that
Wait, but he was calling you to get advice, or why was he?
Oh, I don't know about that. Not listening. Anyway, it was so that relationship with the polity depended not on blood, but on civic affiliation and on civic understanding. In fact, that's certainly one of the places where the whole notion of citizenship, membership in a polity, comes from, as distinct from kinship and other hierarchical relationships. But it's about then democracy, and it requires grounding this kind of membership in the polity in commitments we make to each other, not in transactional ways, but in recognition of each other's equal worth, value, and dignity. It's a moral question with profound practical implications. What do we owe one another? What is the relationship between our rich diversity and the shared commitments that enable democracy to work? It's a very practical question, because the extent to which we can muster the political power to contest for the supermajorities that it takes to restructure our system cannot be created if we're so fragmented, not only in terms of race, gender, or class, but also in the cacophony of issues which become confused with identities, each of us committed only to our issue, and we avoid the hard work of finding the values that can unite us in a common effort, in an effort at rebirth. There are, of course, limits. As James Baldwin wrote, we can disagree and still love each other, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. Now, what does organizing have to do with this? One of the consequences of this sclerotic character of our electoral structures has been that change has often depended on social movements of moral reform, actually modeled on the Great Awakening of the early 19th century, often led by women, that combined personal change, community change, and political change, linked local organization with state organization and national organization that fought for temperance, abolition, women's suffrage, agrarian reform, labor reform, progressivism, civil rights, environmentalism, gender equity, and yes, conservatism. Movements emerge from the efforts of purposeful actors to respond to changes, to conditions they experience as unjust, and to opportunities to assert new public values, form new relationships rooted in those values, and mobilize political, economic, and cultural power to translate those values into action. They differ from fashions, styles, or fads in that they're collective, strategic, and organized. They differ from interest groups in that they're not simply about how to divide up the goodies, but rather to decide what the goodie is. And not content with winning the game, they also try to change the rules. When these movements operate to expand equality of voice, they strengthen democracy. When they narrow equality of voice, they weaken the democracy. So political change in America has always been a dance between social movements, parties, and their interaction, and how they have worked. Our challenge is to link movement energy with the organizational capacity to produce political power. This depends, at least in turn, on our capacity for leadership, organization of action. There's no dearth of energy out there. I mean, youth mobilized around climate change, the climate crisis, Black Lives Matter movement, gender struggles, immigration struggles, economic justice struggles, and more. The problem is that our system makes it nearly impossible to realize the objectives of any of these because of the way in which the structures constrain our political power. And so we have to challenge those structures. And these movements can be a source of energy, invention, capacity. The problem is that we are radically fragmented. And the radical fragmentation is what inhibits our capacity to build the political power that we need to struggle for the kind of change we need. Now, this is where organizing comes in, because organizing is not only about solving immediate problems, like making sure your candidate gets the most votes or putting up a stop sign. It's about doing this and at the same time developing leadership, organization, capacity, and the power to take on structural challenges in the long run. It's not just about fixing a bug in the system, like a safety net. It's about transforming the cultural and economic and political features of the system. One of the main reasons I got hooked on organizing the civil rights movement was that I could work with people to find the resources within themselves and their communities to create the power they needed to change the institutions responsible for their problems in the first place. And that's what healthy democracy requires. Now, I want to conclude here with just some of the practices that are core to this practice of organizing, and we can pursue them further. The first is that organizing requires building relationships rooted in shared values that enable us to make the commitments to each other to work for change. So there is a relational foundation, a civic relational foundation rooted on a commitment to shared values. Second, it requires accessing the emotional resources embedded in our values for the courage to act, for the courage to risk, for the sources of hope, of solidarity, of a sense of self-worth, articulated in the form of narrative, public narrative, a story of self, why do I care? A story of us, why do we care? A story of now, why is now the challenge so urgent that we must respond with hope, not fear, with solidarity, not isolation, with a sense of self-worth and not self-doubt. Third, organizing requires strategizing, turning resources we have into power we need to get what we want. That's all strategy is. And I should say, storytelling, relationship building, and strategizing, they're all things we do every day. The difference here is taking that which we know how to do implicitly and making it explicit so we can bring craft and purpose and intentionality to it. Fourth is action, knowing the difference between 20 people showing up in a meeting and 40 people showing up in a meeting and why. It's about the mobilization and deployment of resources, particularly time, in specific, measurable, and concrete ways. And finally, organizing requires creating structures that enable us to make decisions, coordinate the action, hold ourselves and others accountable, and develop the leadership we need to have the impact we want. I know that word structure can be very scary. All it means is to build. That's the root of it's building. Because when you create structure, what you are, it's an act of hope that there will be a future. Because it's not just about a momentary exchange, it is about the commitments we make to each other about how we're going to work together, how we're going to coordinate what we do. So look, is there a master plan? Is there an easy solution? Maybe you've got it. I haven't come across it. There are opportunities at the local, at the state, at the national levels. Ranked choice voting, for example, and the kind of redistricting that you accomplished here in California with the initiative that takes it out of the hands of politicians. They're not just about process or procedure, they're about power. They're really about how we construct the power of governance in this country. Look at the mobilization taking on local school boards right now. Election officials, state legislators. In fact, charting a way forward depends on each of us owning our responsibility, engaging with one another, finding the common ground, and doing the work. You know, the famed labor organizer and songwriter Joe Hill, when executed in Utah for labor organizing, was known to say, don't mourn for me, organize. I want to close with just a few words by Langston Hughes, the great American poet. These are his words. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me. Let America be the dream, that dreamer's dream. Let it be the great strong land of love, where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by one above. It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. The land that never yet has been, and yet must be, the land where every man is free. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marshall. That is just really, I love Langston Hughes. I really appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with, I think it's nearly 500 of you, talking about what I think is the most important issue facing all of us, which is the future of our democracy. And I wanted to begin with some gratitude as well, Marshall. First of all, to you for your life's work and just this really rich commentary they've provided us this afternoon. It's just such an honor getting to know you and to be in conversation with you today. I also want to thank Juliet for a gracious introduction and the Haas Center for Public Service at Stanford, and this opportunity to partner with the Mario Savio Social Justice Program at Berkeley. And thanks to Juliet and Peggy and Colleen and Ken, I think it's important to name those folks. And a special shout out to Executive Director Tom Schneibalt, who consistently models working across divides, even when we're talking about playful university rivalries. So thank you for that, Tom. As Marshall has shared, democracy and organizing is about people and our capacity to be in conversation and relationship with each other. And so we're looking forward to being in conversation with you in a few minutes. I've been following the chat and it is quite lively, so I'm excited to get to some of those questions. As a reminder, Vandinika, a fellow at Harvard, you may see her on the screen, will be helping us manage some of those questions. So what she'll be doing is watching the chat and the flow of questions, trying to group them in a way that makes sense for where we are in the conversation. And she may reach out to you and you'll have an opportunity to unmute and ask Marshall your question directly. And if we don't get to you during this first formal part of the hour, please stick around because Marshall has graciously agreed to spend a little extra time with us at the close of the formal program to answer more of your questions. So today we are gathering just a few days after the anniversary of the attack on the Capitol and just a few days before we commemorate the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. And it strikes me that in many ways, these two moments represent the two starkly different trajectories that you, Marshall, have put forward in the title of your talk. One that seems intent on the demise of democracy in our current system, and the other rooted in the hope that a truly inclusive, multiracial, and just America is still possible. Which road we take is a choice point, and I think Marshall has very definitely laid out the choices that lay before us. And before we go deeper into some of the points that you raised, Marshall, I wanted to have an opportunity for our audience to hear a little bit more about your journey, because one of the things I found so captivating about your work is the way that you've lifted up public narrative and that weaving of the self with the collective and with action. And so you mentioned some of this. You were part of Freedom Summer in Mississippi in the 60s. I didn't know until recently that Mario Savio was your roommate, quite serendipitous. You organized with the United Farm Workers, and you also were the architect for the organizing strategy for the Obama campaign in 2008. So can you share just a little bit more about how you came to dedicate your life to organizing for social justice and social change?
Well, thanks for the question. Well, it never was a plan, and it never was, a plan. It really had a lot to do with choices made in the moment. I grew up in Bakersfield, but we lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War. My father was a chaplain in the American Army. A lot of his work was as Holocaust survivors. My fifth birthday party was in a camp, a children's DP camp, displaced person camp, where I was supposed to give gifts rather than get them because there were no parents. At first, I thought it was cool. Then I realized why there were no parents. They were gone. And I'm grateful for the fact that my parents interpreted the Holocaust to me as not being simply about anti-Semitism, but about racism, and that racism kills. Turn people into objects, you can do anything. And, you know, when I came to Harvard, you know, from Bakersfield, which is sort of to try to get as far as possible, it was an encounter with enormous elitism that I'd never even imagined before. On the other hand, it was incredibly exciting. It was the year John Kennedy was elected president. But it took a while for me to find my footing there. And it wasn't until 1963 and that was a hell of a year, that summer of 1963. Medgar Evers was assassinated. The 4 little girls were killed in Birmingham. The fire hoses, the March on Washington, and eventually the assassination of President Kennedy. That I began to meet the people actually involved in the civil rights movement, young people. And I admired their courage. I didn't feel sorry for anybody. I admired their courage. My first SNCC staff meeting I went to in Atlanta, Georgia, was at Gammon Theological Seminary. They were meeting in the sanctuary. And I thought there'd be all these charts about strategy and all. They were having a preach-off. What's a preach-off? Who could imitate Dr. King better? There was this sense of celebration, of joy, and of courage, of standing up to the arbitrary power that was being exercised and used. That was so appealing. And so I signed up. But it was really not until Mississippi that I got my education about race, power, and politics in America, with all due respect to Harvard. The inequalities were so stark, and it was also so clear that power was the critical question. It's where I learned the difference between charity and justice. That charity says, how can I help? How can I help? Justice says, why is it happening? Let me change it. That's when you realize you're in a power struggle. So it was in Mississippi that I really came to understand how people could come together and work together to create power. And that was very, very exciting. So instead of going back to school, I wrote a letter and said, how can I come back and study history when we're busy making it, which was arrogant, but also true. Came back here to Bakersfield, met Caesar, and I'd grown up in the farm worker world but hadn't seen it. It took what we call Mississippi eyes to come back home, see another community of people of color, also without political rights, also without economic protections. And of course, this state with its own rich history of racial discrimination going back to the native peoples, Chinese, Japanese, and so forth. And I realized that Mississippi was not an exception to America, it was an example of America that we needed to change. And so I began to work with Caesar for the next 16 years. And it was so generative because it was like working with people whose values you shared, who you admired, and you could actually see it work. You could actually see changes. You could see the person stand up and find courage that hadn't done that before, a community act together that was so divided. And you could see the change that that could produce in the conditions of life, labor conditions, all the rest. So I think of that as my real school for organizing and for craft, was the work with the farm workers. So I don't know, does that, that was a rather long answer to your question.
But very rich and very important. So thank you so much. So now I'm reflecting on, there's so much in your talk that we can talk about, and just a couple of things I want to lift up. And the first one is around the importance of voice. And you talk about the importance of civic associations and sort of aggregating those voices in meaningful ways. And so we know our power as voters and as actors is tied to how and whether we can organize and act collectively. And that often happens through various group identities. So it's parties, or it could be unions or faith communities, or it could be a race or ethnicity-based identity. So in that sense, you know, you talk a lot about identity politics, but in some sense, perhaps all politics is based on some kind of identity, just a question of which identities are being activated and mobilized. So I'd love to hear more from you about what you see as hopeful around groups and organizations that are organizing in a multi-issue, multi-dimensional way to deal with some of the issues that you raised in your talk.
Well, we need a lot more of them. I mean, there are organizations like Isaiah in Minnesota, or Lucha in Arizona, or Amos in Ohio, that are really rooted in traditional community organizing, but are taking it much farther, often have roots in faith-based communities. But what they're committed to is a vision that cuts across particular issue and is rooted in core values. a commitment around respect, around equality, and so forth. What that means is that they can pick issues strategically. So issues become a strategic choice, not a definition of identity. And that allows a much broader breadth of support, of common effort and common purpose. I think that's the direction we have to go in. It is not to negate the importance of our identities in all the different forms, but we are not a single identity. You know, human beings, we are multiple. We are complex. A whole person is a whole person. And we can combine in some ways and separate in other ways. That to me is where the challenge is that we have right now in this country. Because unless we solve that one, we just remain fragmented. And by the way, I'm talking about the people who love democracy. And you know, it's a real fight. That's what's going on right now. And so it's incumbent on us to do that work and find those ways so that our rich diversity becomes an asset, not a liability, because it is an asset. It's a great strength and can be a great strength of multiracial democracy. But we got to do the work to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one other question about our current political moment. Then I want to let Vandinika know that she's on deck to start queuing our questions. But I was really struck by something you said early on in your talk about that we develop understanding through our actions. And as I think about our current political moment, one of the things I would say, like about once a week, I get something on Facebook that, you know, someone's saying like, are we paying attention? This is really bad, people. Do you know how bad it is? You know, recently I got something signed by 100 political scientists, basically saying we need to understand what is really at risk here. And the responses, at least from where I sit, seem kind of anemic. And I wonder if it's because we're trying to decide what it is we need to do before we act, versus what you're suggesting is that we will know what to do as we act, and that we need leaders to sort of show the way. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Sandra, I love that. I think that is spot on. You don't learn anything by sitting around speculating about what might be the right thing to do. You act and you learn. The critical thing is that we act with each other. See, this is where the challenge is. I think that's so great. You know, all the forces of individualism and all of that we're trying to deal with, unless we find ways to act collectively together, then so yes, but you know, strategy is a verb, not a noun. You strategize. You know, David set out to deal with Goliath and taking the advice of the king to use a sword, a shield, and a helmet. He realized he couldn't, they were too heavy. That's when he realized, oh, as a shepherd, he could use a stone and a sling, and Goliath was just another wolf or another bear. In other words, it is a process of learning through action. That's how strategy actually works. So until we get into action, we don't have an opportunity to learn. And so I think that's spot on. And I think then the question, though, is how do we come together? How do we bring ourselves together? With whom? And that's where I think there is a real leadership challenge right now. And maybe this isn't appropriate to say, but I'm involved some with Danielle Allen's run for governor in Massachusetts. She's an extraordinary candidate whose whole orientation is toward what we're talking about. And we need more like that. We need more grassroots organization like that. I know how easy it is for me to say this, and I know how hard the reality is. I guess one reason I was trying to emphasize what I was trying to emphasize is to be clear just what the challenge looks like. Because the reality is that fear doesn't mobilize, well, how can I say, despair, grievance doesn't mobilize, hope does. Mm-hmm. And unless we find the hopeful pathways forward, then we're stuck. And the way we find those pathways is to get out there and get into it.
Great, thank you. So I want to open it up now. Vandinika, if you can help us identify our first person, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, Marshall. Hello, everyone. You will receive a direct chat from me if you're up next to ask your question. Please unmute and begin with your full name and where you're tuning in from. And if you're a student, your degree and your major. And these questions, I'm sure, can be for both Sandra and Marshall. And we're beginning with Vanessa Poster. So please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi. My name is Vanessa Poster. I'm in Redondo Beach, California. I graduated in '86 with a bachelor's from and a master's at Stanford. My master's is in modern thought and literature. My question is about these divisions that we have in our society right now, where there's vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. There's people who think that January 6th, 2021 was a cry for freedom and revolution, and those of us who think that it was treason and violence. And then people who are attacking critical race theory. We're going to lose abortion rights this year. How do we overcome those divisions? How do we talk to people, not the people who already agree with us, but people like Liz Cheney, who could be partners in creating democracy, but who we disagree with on everything else? So how do we overcome those divisions?
Well, it's a good question. And there are divisions you can overcome, and there are divisions over which you need to have a struggle. And I think it's really important to distinguish the two. And that's why the James Baldwin quote for me is so helpful in trying to understand, what are the boundaries here? What are the boundaries? Now, from my perspective, the folks committed to democracy are a number one challenge because of all the fragmentation, all the division, the lack of participation, the infight, all the rest of that. Now, that's where I think we need to do a lot of work. Now, in terms of reaching out to the folks who look at it differently, people like Dave Fleischer in LA, who developed deep canvassing as a way of, they were actually formed after Prop 8-1 here in California in 2008, the anti-marriage equality, going to communities and the precincts that had voted against the gay community and figuring out how to have conversations that weren't just about the issue, but that became relational conversations, trying to resituate difference on issue in relationship and trying to find where the common values are that can resituate an issue difference and keep it from being so defining. There are efforts like that and people doing that in a lot of different parts of the country. There certainly needs to be more. But I also think that we really need to do work with those of us who are committed to democracy to become as strong as we can and as powerful as we can. I mean, there's nothing comparable out there to what's happening with the school boards and the election officials right now. Why not? Why not? To me, that's where the number one challenge, I take your point completely, but that's where I think there's an immediate challenge that we have to address. I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree with you. I think the degree of infighting that I've seen in some movement spaces is really unfortunate. And starting there with how we can work with those who are our allies and our advocates is a great way to start. That said, I would be mindful of not completely giving up on some of those folks who are not aligned with us. One of the things I did last semester is I taught a class on right-wing organizing in rural parts of the country. And I had some guest speakers that came to talk about this. And one of the things they talked about is that oftentimes in these small rural areas that have, their own insecurities and suffering, the only people out there are the people who are anti-democratic.
Sorry.
And we've really ceded that ground to them. And I think that's really unfortunate and to our own detriment. And so not giving up on that. I mean, surprisingly, what they shared with me, and I've experienced this in my own life sometimes, and I think deep canvassing kind of gets at it too, is that it may not be as heavy a burden to bear as you think. You may not be having to roll that boulder up as high as you think, because sometimes what they're really looking for is some kind of engagement and to be seen and to be heard and to be listened to.
You know, Sandra, I couldn't agree more. I think that from the perspective of the Democratic Party, Howard Dean's 50 Straight strategy was the right thing. Because when you remove yourself from debate in districts that you saw it's a red district, or cities or states, well, of course, it's not challenged. There's no challenge going on. And there's no education going. Education, you know, controversy can educate. And that's sort of the one of the premises of our system, that controversy can be very positive. But if there's no controversy because only one voice is being heard, that's a problem. And I think it's absolutely right. You know, in part, it's about cost benefit politics. You know, the money goes to where there's a chance of winning now. And everything is so much reduced to money that's what happens. And so the money doesn't go anywhere but swing states. It doesn't go anywhere where it's an investment in actually building something for the future. It's all short term. And it's too money dependent to begin with. I am so tired of getting those pitches and say, here's how you participate in politics. Give money, give money, give money. No, I want to give time. I want to give my heart. I want to engage, and I want to engage with other people.
Absolutely. I can't believe we're down to the last 5 minutes of our first hour. So that, who knows, maybe there'll be a part 2 at some point. But I just wanted to give that moment. I don't know if we wanted to kind of one more question before we close the formal portion of our time together. Vandenica, did you have a question?
Yeah, we have many. So we're going to hear from Charlie Hoffs.
Professor Gans, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. This was such an incredible and transformative lecture. My name's Charlie. I am a senior undergraduate here at Stanford studying chemical engineering, a field I originally chose, wanting to urgently apply science to sustainability challenges. But over the past few years, I've had my whole philosophy radically shaken by the baffling dimensions of these challenges that will take so much more than science to address through action, through youth-led activism, through policy, through systems and human change. To that end, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on what special power and assets and skills might young people be able to bring in this moment to enact and potentially in the future lead, or right now lead, transformative systems change?
Well, what a wonderful question. You know, one of the reasons I love teaching is it's an opportunity to have a conversation with the future on a regular basis. And that is a dimension. You know, there's a Protestant theologian, Walter Brueggemann, wrote a book called Prophetic Imagination, in which he argues that transformational vision occurs at the intersection of two things. One is criticality, a clear view of the world's need, of its hurt, of its pain. The other one is hope, a sense of its promise and possibilities. Young people come of age with a critical eye on the world they find, and almost of necessity, hopeful hearts. It was like that for my generation. I think it is for this one too. And from my perspective, you are the future. This is your future. And, you know, there's no quick, easy answers. It is getting into it. And what you bring to it is your courage, is your impatience, is your imagination, and the fact you're going to be around for quite a while. And that's a good long-term kind of plan. I hope that's helpful. There is such a deep affinity between generation change and social change. We really need to get that. And I've been working recently with folks at Sunrise who are trying to turn their mobilization into organization so they can become more powerful. And I think there is lessons to be learned there as well. But no, I'd love to continue the conversation. Thanks for the question, Charlie. It's so spot on.
So we're at time for the formal portion. We're now going to stay on and continue answering some of your questions. But if folks only had an hour to be with us, thank you. We so appreciate it. And maybe we'll just move on to the next question if you have it, Vandenica.
I just wanted to check in. I saw Juliet unmute, so
Sorry.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted, on behalf again of the Haas Center, and Sandra, thanks so much for mentioning the Mario Savio Social Justice Program at Berkeley, which also is co-sponsoring this event. And I apologize for not mentioning that at the top, but we're so thrilled to have had the support of that wonderful sister organization. And I just want to, on behalf of the Haas Center and the Mario Savio Program, thank you both so much for this conversation. I think, one note that I wrote while you were talking, despair doesn't mobilize, hope does. And then I think the chat reflects how many of our hearts were filled with hope hearing Charlie's question and your answer, and the prospect of having a conversation with the future is really, for those of us who are lucky enough to do this work in an educational environment, that is such a blessing. So thank you for mentioning that. And just thank you to both of you for this remarkable conversation. And we are so excited to keep this going, not only now for a little bit more time, but also going forward with you in residence, Marshall. So thank you again, everyone, and good night to those who can't stay.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you. Okay.
Great. So go ahead, Vandenica.
all right. So I think continuing on after Charlie's question, we have a question from Angie Gomez, if she's still on the call.
Yeah, so I guess I had kind of a similar question. It's actually, my name is Angie Gomez, and I'm an undergraduate studying sociology and comparative ethnic studies here at Stanford.
Right.
I'm actually from Salinas, California as well.
Oh, all right. Yeah. Where? East Salinas.
And I'm currently working with Youth Salinas activists about various kind of issues that they're really interested in, and also advocating for. So hearing that people are motivated by hope rather than despair, and also how, I guess one of the bigger questions that I have is about your own political education as a younger person and current political education for you. So kind of your thoughts about how to really instigate political education for youth, particularly how political education through action is really important for youth right now in the moment, and to organize for the future.
Boy, this is a good conversation to have, because it is grounded in action, but not just action. In other words, it's also reflection. It's also drawing the lessons from action. And one of the ways that we teach organizing is by creating what we call a brave space, not a safe space, where it's a little bit like learning how to ride a bicycle. You got to get on the bike. You're going to fall. That's your moment of truth. You go home, go to bed, or you get back up on the bike, knowing that you're going to keep falling as the only way to learn to keep your balance. But it isn't just the action, it's the reflection. And, at the end of every action we do, we have what we call pluses, deltas, takeaways. That learning is fundamental to organizing, and it's fundamental to leadership. And it isn't an add-on, it isn't an extra, it's not something you do in a training session, it's something you do in the work that you're doing. And, so that's certainly, for me, I know that's how I did a lot of learning, was in that way. But, it's also grappling with some of the conceptual work that helps us understand more deeply why we're in the mess we're in. I think we have to do that work, whether we call it political education or whatever the term is. We have to find good ways to do that, because, well, for obvious reasons. But that's some of my thoughts about that. But I'd be happy to, have a further conversation. I think it's great you're from Salinas. I sort of want to ask you, well, where do you live in Salinas? Because I spent a lot of time there.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. That's the work that we do I do at Cal and at my center. It's the work that the Haas Center does. And I think one of the things that really ignites political action for young people is to find those things that they're passionate about, maybe through a life experience, and to then help them see how that's a pathway towards being engaged and being engaged collectively. So critical. And I also would definitely co-sign with the reflection is so important.
Yeah, that's really right. You know, sometimes students will say, how can I, I need to plan out the next 30 years. I say, what? What are you talking about? That's not how life works. It's not linear. And to echo what Sandra's saying, know what you care for. Know what you really care. Do the work to get at those values that actually move you. Listen to them, because they'll take you in the right direction, because it'll draw you to what you want to do. You will do it better, and you'll learn from it, and it will open other pathways. This idea of I'm going to be strategic about where I want to be in 20 years, come on. Life's just not really like that. I mean, so yeah, thanks, Sandra, for that point. I think it's spot on. It's right on.
And also for the advice, I think as a senior, the latter portion was very timely.
Right.
As a senior, so I'm like, the latter portion of not wanting to plan life and following passion and what you care about, I really appreciate that. So thank you.
Good. No, good. It really is real. Yeah.
Right. Next, we have a question from Sharat Israni.
Hey, Marshall. Thank you all for this beautiful evening. I'm a hardcore technologist who stepped into the world of medicine 8 years ago, and I'm so glad I did. Learned a whole bunch of new things. Think I'm doing some good stuff. I was at Stanford, then I'm now at UCSF. 5 years ago, almost exactly to the day, I was one of probably 100,000 people who marched in San Francisco to protest or express our view that this was not our president. But as I was walking with everybody, I noticed every group of 10 people was protesting something completely different. And so my question is, I don't understand, maybe as a technologist, what to organize around if we cannot reach one vision of what to rally around something. And if you agree with that, how do we get to that one sort of pole star, North Star?
Boy, I want to say, well, you're the doctor. No, but I won't say that. No, it's really challenging, because it's not enough to say we're not them. You got to say what we are. And to answer the question what we are with 10,000 answers does not help. And so for me, it's finding the venues or creating the venues in which we can do that work to go deeper into what it is which actually moves us. We find doing what we call public narrative work, which probes our sources of value, experiential, not philosophical, our sources of hurt, our sources of hope, our sources of caring. It turns out that human beings actually have a lot of common sources of both. And it's almost like the earlier in life you get, the more commonality you find. You know, doing this narrative work in the Middle East, in Japan, in different places, it's remarkable how deep you can go quickly, how quickly you can go deep if you look for those sources of value experientially. I think there's so much we could do in that domain, but we have to create the venues. We have to create the places where the work gets done. And everybody's rushing around so much, you know, it's a challenge. And I think from my perspective, that's one of the most important things we could do, is figure out how to actually create those venues. Because what you say is absolutely right. So I don't know, that's something we can work on.
Can I ask you a follow-up question to that, Marshall? Because this idea of public narrative is so critical, and you talk about it a lot in your work, and it being so essential to organizing and social change. And, you know, we as a country are in a moment where the American narrative is being hotly contested. And it just makes me wonder, you know, what are the possibilities of crafting an American narrative where we can feel that, you know, we're addressing the complexities of that history and the difficulties of that history, but also doing so in the way that there's a pathway forward for some kind of a collective identity.
No, yeah, Sandra, boy, when we answered that one, I mean, one thing is, it's not going to happen from the message factories in DC. Mm-hmm. That's not where it's going to happen. It's going to come out of the work. It's going to come out of movements, because that movements tell stories. I mean, that's sort of, you know, core to what a movement is a storytelling. And what storytelling is really about how we find the emotional resources to confront challenges, to confront the unexpected. That's what happens in a plot. That's what it's all about, is how can I confront the unexpected and access sources of hope as opposed to fear. Solidarity and it's emotional in content. It's felt, it's experienced. It's not theoretical. It's not words on a message, on a mission statement. Now, so I think that's where it has to come from. And I think we need to work at that, and not be afraid of it. And I don't know, I find a rich appetite for doing this kind of work. It sort of used to be that, and it still is to some extent, who you are was a function of your family, your class, your gender, your position, and so on and so forth. And I worked with a lot of people from the Middle East, in South Asia, and so forth. And it's sort of like a lot more of who we are is up to us now. And so we have to do the work with each other to do that. Colleges and universities ought to be a major place where that work gets done. It ought to be scaffolded here. Places, I don't know that it does very much. And certainly, so I don't know, that's sort of a starting point, I think. But yeah, it's, the narrative work is extraordinarily helpful. I mean, the first time I started doing this work in the Arab Middle East in Jordan, I was told, oh, no, people will never talk about themselves openly here. It took about like 5 minutes. And then I understood the Hakawati tradition in the Arab world of storytelling. Everybody tells stories. And stories are rooted in shared human experience. Sometimes working with ancient texts, like those in the Quran, or those in the various religious sources, can be very fruitful. Not because they had the science right, but because human struggles are human struggles. And I think it's something about recapturing that core humanity, and narrative can help do it. And like I say, I think we have to find the venues in which to do that.
There are lots of questions on the chat, and we're keeping a track of time, but also keeping a track of the previous questions. Olivia Fu has a question, so I'm going to invite her to come on and ask her question. Olivia, are you there?
Yes, I am. I apologize for the bad lighting in my house.
No apology.
But hello, thank you so much. That was such a moving and inspiring talk. My name is Olivia. I'm an undergrad studying urban studies. And my question, I think, is kind of a follow-up from Charlie's in a way. But I was really moved by your comments on how relationships are at the foundation of organizing. I think that really resonated with me in my short and limited experiences in life so far. And while it's been it's very motivating and inspiring a lot of time to hear, how youth are the future and how we're going to change all these things. But something that I know myself and other youth activists and organizers have struggled with is how, bringing forth these new ideas and trying things, but in the end, we come to learn a lesson or, duplicate an effort that our predecessors from decades ago kind of already went through the work and learned those lessons, but that knowledge wasn't available. So my question is, if you have advice for young activists and organizers for how to build cross-generational relationships or sort of learn this institutional knowledge from folks like yourself who have these lifelong experiences of organizing, so that, going forward, we really are able to progress and not repeat past mistakes.
It's very inspiring to be invited into cross-generational conversation. It really is. And I think, again, it's creating the settings for that. Now, by the way, we are going to be having a workshop here at Stanford in 3 weeks on organizing. And we're going to dig deep into these different practices, relationship building and so forth. And that's part of the idea, is to equip folks with these basic kinds of skills to begin doing that kind of work and to do the learning. What you're suggesting is, my generation, we didn't want to know anything about the past because, we were it. Maybe so, maybe not. So I think it's a very wise question, and it's a wonderful opportunity that you're offering. It's one reason I enjoy working with Sunrise. There are others who would too. And it's not just, I don't know, sometimes like it's not sitting around telling war stories. It's actually a conversation. You know, at Harvard, we had the 50th anniversary of the sit-in at Harvard in 1969. That was a big anti-Vietnam protest. A lot of people came back who were part of that, but in a dialogue with the current activists fighting on divestment and all the rest of it. That was the cool part. That was the really cool part. So look, any way you want to organize those kinds of conversations, you're going to find, at least from my perspective, a lot of interest. I don't know, Sandra, what's your take on that?
Yeah, this is like music to my heart. It's so close to how I think about the work. And, you know, a few years ago, I felt very similarly. I was quite a bit older than you, so I'm slow on the uptake. But I decided to do a much deeper dive into the Southern freedom struggle about 10 years ago or so, maybe a little bit longer. And actually studied with some of the folks that Marshall actually worked with in the 60s. And it was eye-opening. And it also made me realize that, you know, there's so much about our society that's about new innovation, and which is great, but there's also a lot of things that we don't need to reinvent. And there's a lot of wisdom there. And one of the things I would share that really impacted me is to think about, what does it mean to be an elder? And the elders I know who are really effective recognize that eldership is a communal designation. You don't designate yourself as an elder, your community does, and they look to you. And so it's, how do we find that way to connect youth who are looking for that kind of knowledge and engagement and support with those who are willing to be in relationship with youth as educators, yes, but also as partners, and how we can move this forward.
Yeah. Yeah, you got two folks signed up right now.
Yeah.
No, that's so right, Sandra. Yeah.
Thank you for incredible answers.
No, incredible question.
Thank you. We'll hear from Liz Bradley next.
Hi, my name's actually Jamie Bradley Kissel. My mom's a Stanford graduate. I'm a senior at Oberlin College. I'm a political theory major. So I have a question in that vein. There is a common claim that the United States is not and has never been a democracy, whether it's in our foreign policy or in our own laws, particularly slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, et cetera. How would you respond to those claims? And then on top of that, even bigger question, how do we build democracy in a place where the concept of democracy has been, I don't know, I used the word co-opted, but might not think it has been.
No. I'm curious. What do you think about this? No, I'm serious, really.
I mean, my answer personally is through grassroots organizing and trying to build dual power structures and creating actually democratic forms of like governance outside of perhaps the direct system that we live in, / you know, making sure we don't do imperialist wars. But I don't know. I'm 22.
No, Sandra, you want to go with that first? No, I'm happy to go with it.
Please do. I'm sort of gathering my thoughts.
No, I guess what I was trying to say earlier was that we've never been a representative. In other words, we've never been a representative democracy in the sense of equal voice. We have not. It's been more of an aspiration, and it's been more of a sort of putting something out there that we could be. And usually we get moved in that direction by the struggles of the people who have suffered the most from it not being a democracy. And so, you know, the struggles, the Black liberation struggles, the struggles of women for rights, struggles of workers have been ways that have expanded that notion. And I think we're at a real inflection point right now. You know, I really do. It's one reason why I started the way I did. I want us to understand that we have not yet become a genuinely representative democracy. Now the question is, can we? And so that to me is the fight here. And whether it's at a local, state, national level, we have to find a way to push that forward. And I don't think, you know, civil society organization is very, very important. There's no question about it. But we also have to contest political power. You know, it is real. And I think we can't step back from it. We have to try to claim it. And that's another real challenge, I think, because it's like, oh, politics are dirty. No. It's got to be real about it. And you know, I love the in Matthew 10:16. I know it's a Bible class here. When Jesus is going to send his followers out to tell a story, he says, "If I'm going to set you as sheep among wolves, you must be innocent as doves and wise as serpents." You know, it's that combination of understanding reality and bringing core values to the struggle with reality is where it's at, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, you were basically heading the same direction I was, which is, you know, when I did my deeper dive into the Southern freedom struggle, I started reading more deeply the work of Vincent Harding. And I think of that generation, he was one of the most hopeful. And he often asked the question, is America still possible? And in his work, he really talked about it and illuminated that in the Black liberation struggle, while it's highly critical, rightly so, of America's challenges and with the democratic governance, among other things, that also African Americans have often been the most hopeful and have been driving that change to expand democracy. And I think holding those two truths and still being able to plot a path forward is what's inspired me to continue in the work.
You know, there's a definition of hope that I find really helpful. Not like flowers in May, but the 12th century philosopher Maimonides had an understanding of hope, which was its belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. I mean, what he's saying, to be a realist is to recognize that we live in a world in which it is always probable Goliath will win, but sometimes David does. That it was improbable we would elect a Black man president of this country in 2007. It happened. And we have those kinds of experiences in our own lives. So that hope is about sense of possibility. It's a place between fantasy and certainty. So it's not fantasy and it's not certainty, it's possibility. Mm-hmm. And that's where the courage comes in to take the risks involved in trying to realize those possibilities.
Absolutely. So we are really out of time now for this last portion, but I believe we have one last question, Vandenica.
Yes, one last, even though there's so many on the chain, we will have Joan Lambert come up.
And then Marshall's going to offer us a song to take us out.
Oh, yeah. Everybody's
hi. Thank you so much for taking my question. And it's been so just inspiring to hear from you, Marshall, and you, Sandra, and also from all the students. I have kids myself, the students' age, and I just have to say that really made my day. And also I wanted to say thank you for mentioning school boards. I'm actually a former local school board member. I was on the school board in Menlo Park for 8 years. So a lot of good work being done on local school boards throughout the country. But my question is really just more about what sort of there's a lot of people on this call who I think have been inspired and want to take some action, but, may be busy and have jobs and kids and lives. And I'm wondering if you can speak to us for a minute and just tell us, give us some direction. Are there some actions that we can take, to help ensure that our democracy is strengthened, not just now, but, going forward for our kids and grandkids?
Boy, Sandra, you want that one?
The easy ones. The only thing I can think of, again, it sort of harkens back to what you said earlier, is that you have to act your way into what to do. And so what is before you to do? I think about that a lot for myself. I live in the Berkeley bubble, and I often wonder, like, is my world representative of what's happening? But instead of getting sort of caught up in that, I just do what is put before me to do. And sometimes those are small things. And sometimes those small things grow into larger things. And that's what I feel like I can do in this moment, as well as staying connected to movements and organizers and other folks who are doing some of the larger work. But really what motivates me and what keeps me energized is doing the work that's put before me to do.
One of the things that I would look for is who is actually organizing people. In other words, there are a lot of groups that are advocating this, that, or the other. They exist mainly because a funder thinks they should exist, but they don't have a base in a community of people to whom they're responsible. Whether it's, we've been doing a lot of work with mayors here in the last few years. There's some terrific people at that level of democratic leadership. So much more can be done there. And, of course, unions represent. But I would look for that question about organizations that actually have a body, because people who represent those organizations treat strategy very differently than people whose whole reason for being is arguing a particular point of view. It's the difference between an ideological orientation and a more, I can say, human. I don't mean to put down ideologies, just Pope Francis interestingly distinguishes between what he calls liberation theology, the theology of ideas, and liberation of the people's theology, which is rooted in people and in their understanding, needs, and values. That's kind of where I'd be looking for stuff, if that makes sense. That makes sense to you?
It does make sense. And I know I see some people adding some groups in the comments, so I'll definitely look at that as well. And I feel like a lot of people I know, and a lot of my friends have the same questions, so I will definitely encourage them to watch this video and hopefully if there are additional things that that you recommend, maybe whoever's organizing this can somehow get that out to people it sounds like we're going to get a copy of the chat, so that would be wonderful.
It's really interesting. A lot of the work I do based back at school, but I work with what's called the Leading Change Network, which is a network of educators, organizers. It's not just US, it's global, who are working on these things. And I'd encourage you to take a look at that website and see, because there's lots of people who want to do this stuff that you're describing. And we need to do a much better job of communicating that. And I'm sure there are other sources, but that's one that I do want to suggest you might take a look at. It's just leadingchangenetwork.org.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Hey, can I add one other thought, which is that, back in November of 2020, when we were really fearful that there would be some kind of a coup to prevent the election happening, I was involved in some organizing that George Lakey put together. Marshall, I don't know if you're aware of that. So they did, yes. And so I was involved in the local piece of that. And just a plug for one of my friends, Kazu Haga, his book, Healing Resistance, I highly recommend it, was one of the local organizers doing some of that work. And at that point, it did not happen. But I will say that it was great to be in community with people who were thinking about the possibility of something that even, 4 years earlier we thought was not possible, to really be exploring just what the risks that we are facing and also to see our capacity to organize to respond to that. There's still people that I connected with through that process that I stay in contact with and that help me stay informed and to think about what I might want to do next. So I would just say, again, I would just echo what Marshall is saying. There are those organizations there and to connect with them and just stay in touch, and they can let you know how to be involved.
Just one other thought on that. You know, a domain in which there is a whole lot of energy and need is in the whole domain of health and public health and healthcare, which, boy, it's so obvious right now. And I think there is huge potential there. We've been working a lot with people involved in, medical students, public health students, and so forth, who are trying to bring an organizing perspective into the struggle for good health, not just advocacy, but in the way it actually works. Now in Boston for first-year residents, we do training in public narrative because people are called to healing, but they're made to be bean counters or bureaucrats. And so there are these well springs of values motivation in health, in education, in a lot of domains that I think we could pay a lot more attention to. And our current Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, is terrific, really gets this stuff and sees the moral and political potential of organizing around health.
Wonderful. Okay, so I hate to cut us off, but we are at time, and I want to make sure we get to our song.
Oh, okay.
So Marshall, if you could share that.
All right, the song, Have No Fear. I won't sing it. In the fourth grade, I was told, please just mouth the words. And so that was kind of the end of my singing aspirations. But this is a song that was recorded by Judy Collins in the 60s. And it uses the word freedom because, civil rights movement never called itself civil rights movement. It called itself the freedom movement, which is a much, much bigger word than legal rights. It's about solidarity. It's about strength. It's about dignity and opportunity. And so understand it in those terms. And the song goes like this. Freedom doesn't come like a bird on the wing. It doesn't fall down like the summer rain. Freedom is a hard-won thing. You have to work for it. You have to fight for it, day and night for it. And every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children, brother. Pass it on to your children, sister. They have to work for it. They have to fight for it day and night for it. And every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children. Pass it on. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to do some passing of it on. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Marcia. And we are so grateful for this time we've had with you. I wrote down 3 words that came up for me as you were speaking: hope, heart, and humanity. Thank you so much for that. And thank you everyone for joining us. And the recording will be made available, and I highly recommend that you watch it and share it.